Hello, Year 10, and welcome to today's lesson. Before we start, please make sure you've downloaded the following file, which is the Lara Audience and Reception document. A knowledge retrieval task. This should take you about 10 minutes. It's a 9-mark question, and this is a question about narrative theory. How useful is narrative theory when discussing video games? Answer with reference to Lara Croft Go. It's a 9-mark question. It's an AO2 question. It's asking you to analyze. In this case, it's an analysis of narrative theory in relation to Lara Croft Go, and it's asking your opinion. So how useful is narrative theory when discussing video games? So you're obviously talking about narrative theory such as Prop, Todorov, Levi-Strauss. You are offering an opinion as to whether or not it is useful when discussing video games. You need to begin with your opinion, and you need to give evidence of the game, and you need to obviously use that XOX structure where you are presenting a counter argument, which you then explain why that counter argument is wrong. So you should spend about 9 minutes, 10 minutes on this question, and then when you're ready, move on to the next slide. So today we are considering media representations, and we're thinking about how Lara Croft, to some extent, is a female stereotype, but in some respects she does subvert female stereotypes. But we could also consider how there are masculine qualities to Lara Croft. We also need to consider how good and evil and time and place are represented in the game. So, in terms of Lara Croft, when you think about her as the central protagonist of the game, which she is, and the extent to which she links to stereotypes of female identity, and in fact, whether in order to subvert those stereotypes, she takes on masculine elements. We need to think a little bit about how and why she might appeal to certain audiences, and we need to think about how good and evil are represented in the game, also in terms of time and place. So Lara Croft is basically the first significant female protagonist in a major role-playing video game series. Now, there have been female protagonists in games before. Lara Croft is probably the first one to transcend video games and enter broader public consciousness. So that makes her significant compared to other female characters in games and other characters from RPG games, role-playing games. Now, most protagonists and hero characters in video games are likely to be male, particularly in adventure role-playing games where you can't design your own character. So traditionally, the protagonist of a role-playing game is a male character. And generally, male characters in video games are stereotypically masculine. They control the action, they think rationally, they solve problems, they win. There's a particular emphasis on hardware, such as cars, weapons, and machines. And so there is a stereotypical quality about male gaming characters. Now, Lara Croft does all of these things as well. So this could be seen to make her countertypical to other female characters in games because she adopts many of these characteristics, making her an independent and indeed assertive action hero. However, as you probably noticed, the way Lara is designed, her physique, her revealing costumes seem to be designed partly as a voyeuristic attempt to attract a male audience and gain wider media attention. And in this respect, she is obviously quite stereotypical of not just female gaming characters, but females in the media in general, where there is an emphasis on looks and particularly body shape. And indeed, the first version of Lara, the original version, which is the one that you can see in the graphic, in fact, her body shape is completely surreal and bizarre. And in reality, because of the way she is designed, she would never actually, in reality, be able to achieve anything like what she achieves in the game because of the over the top way that she's been designed. So in that respect, there is a very stereotypical male voyeuristic quality, and voyeurism is the pleasure of looking, which is very important in terms of thinking about female representation. So please make sure before you move on that you've answered these questions. Why is Lara significant compared to other RPG characters? RPG stands for role-playing game, in case you weren't sure. In what ways is Lara Croft countertypical to other female characters? So how is she different to traditional characters in video games? And in what ways is she stereotypical? And how does she meet or represent stereotypes of not just female gaming characters, but females, women in the media? When you've answered those questions, please move on to the next slide. So Lara Croft, in terms of her representation, she is important in terms of her gender representation, and it's worth noting that although, as we've discussed, the number of gamers in terms of gender is shifting. In terms of game designers and developers, they are predominantly male. I think only 22% in 2017 were male. So, because Lara Croft is the first significant female protagonist in a major video game series, she does have an important impact and an important influence on the representation of women in video games. But she is a divisive figure. As mentioned, some people see her as a strong, proactive female, a powerful female character who demonstrates that female characters can do the same as male characters. And it gives female gamers a female character to identify with. And so there are positive aspects for representation. However, it is not too far to say that she is objectified. She is a sexual object with skimpy clothes, large breasts, and designed to attract what's called the male gaze. In that there is this what's called scopophilia, this pleasure of looking, and that therefore there isn't that sense that she has been designed as somebody that women can identify with, rather as opposed to somebody that men can ogle at. And there is it is true to say that Core Design, who were the software house that created the original Tomb Raider game, were all men, and that Lara Croft therefore is a woman designed by men. And getting beyond the physical side of it, there is that sense that she is basically a male character, that in a way that any sort of feminine elements are undermined by the fact that she's presented as a very masculine character, and that the various traits that make her a strong character are basically male action hero traits that have just been grafted onto a female character. Now, again, that may or may not be a negative thing. It may be wrong to identify these traits as masculine traits, but it is a criticism that's been levelled at the game. And in fact, it is worth noting that all of these representations could be seen to be true. It is clear that Lara Croft is an important character and has inspired other strong female characters in video games, and so she does have an important influence there. But it is also true to say that part of her appeal, part of her longevity in the male audience, is to do with the design of the character. So before you move on, please make sure that you've answered these questions. Firstly, identify the different views of Lara Croft in terms of how different people see her. Does this representation affect the quality of the game? Well, it depends on your point of view. I mean, some might argue that it doesn't matter what the character looks like because that's only a small part of the gameplay, and that if you're playing the game simply to look at Lara Croft, then you're not really playing the game for the right reasons. But some might argue that the fact that the game is very much focused in terms of the character design on a male perception of what women in inverted commas should look like, that does affect the quality of the game, and that for some people the enjoyment of the game might be undermined by the fact that it is this very, to a certain extent, quite a sexist and old-fashioned way of looking at women, rather than a modern and more balanced view of women. And it could, of course, lead to a degree of sexism beyond the game and ideas about what women should look like and what female bodies should look like, which clearly are unrealistic. And I think these are problems that have stemmed from Tomb Raider as much as they do about a more general debate in the media about female representation and the way women should look compared to men. I think Tomb Raider is the original games. I think are influenced themselves by those stereotypes. I don't think the games cause the stereotypes. I think it is fair to say that as the games developed, particularly the latest games, there has been a conscious effort by the designers to challenge those stereotypes. We'll look at that a bit later on. So we need to bear in mind that Lara Croft is a designed character and that she was created by male designers, and that does influence the way that she looks and the way that she's represented. So, in terms of gender representation, um, is Lara Croft an exception or an example of a wider problem in the gaming industry? I say that she's both, because obviously, on the one hand, she challenged the stereotype of female characters in games, which tended to be the victims, tended to be the character that needed rescuing or a character that basically didn't contribute to the action. Whereas Lara Croft is a dynamic, proactive character and um, is the character that you play. And even as a male gamer, you're playing a female character. That's quite an interesting experience. However, as we've discussed already, she does represent a stereotypical view of how women should look. And the gaming industry, being very heavily dominated by men, does tend to present female stereotypes, and particularly focusing on body shape, which is this broader issue. Now, her appearance has changed over the years. If you watched the video the other day, you'll have seen how Lara Croft's character design has evolved, and part of that's to do with the improvements in software and hardware. So that as consoles and technology gets better, we can end up with more photorealistic character, and that's obviously a good thing because you get a more realistic character. But then obviously you'll have noticed that body shape also changes quite radically, which may or may not be a good thing. But the until quite recently, the character design of Lara in skimpy shorts and a kind of crop top has been the defining iconography of the character, and you see that in the cartoon there. And that Lara Croft's visual representation, in a certain way, has changed, and certain way it's stayed the same. In terms of social and cultural context, to start off with, Lara Croft, is an iconic character and is a recognisable character. And people who've never played a Tomb Raider game might still recognise Lara Croft. But obviously, social attitudes to the representation of women have changed since the mid 90s, and the cultural significance of the Tomb Raider games and the broader cultural representation of women in films and games has changed, and that therefore what was acceptable in the 90s in terms of what is quite a sexist representation is no longer acceptable. That's partly to do with the number of female gamers, it's partly to do with the number of female game developers, it's partly to do with social attitudes towards gender representation, and that it is less acceptable now to judge women on the way that they look, although it does still happen, but it does now come across as a little bit stereotypical, a little bit sexist. And so socially and culturally, the way we represent women, particularly in video games, but in the broader media, has changed. Although it is fair to say that there is still this element of voyeurism, and there is still this element on judging women with how they look. So this basically makes Lara something of a problematic character, in that although on the one hand she is a strong female protagonist, she is still a character whose defining features are physical. And she does go beyond video games. As I mentioned, you've watched the trailers to the films, you'd be aware that she does appear in comic books, she appears in novels. The things that have remained consistent are generally that she is an attractive young woman, and you know, roughly in her 20s. She is physically very fit, but she's also physically, very conventionally attractive, and is clothed in such a way that is not really practical for raiding tombs or fighting monsters, but does allow her to show off her body and her legs. And if you want to think about it, the character doesn't get any choice about that. That is how the character is designed. She has no control over that. Even when she's wearing other outfits, they do tend to be quite skimpy. So please make sure you've answered those questions about stereotypes, about appearance, about significance, and about the problematic character, and then move on to the next slide. So I want you to think about the fact that this character is over 20 years old now. Lara Croft first appeared in 1996 and has appeared in a number of games since then. And you'll notice that the character design has evolved as technology has evolved, but you'll also notice that there are some elements which have remained the same. And why have some things changed? Why have some things stayed the same? Well, partly to do with the iconography of the character. The brunette hair, the long hair in the ponytail, they are iconic of the character. The kind of feisty look, the pronounced eyes, the gunplay. I mean, iconically, Lara Croft dual wields pistols. She has those brown shorts, the sort of the generally turquoise top, tight top, the holsters attached to her legs, the boots. These are all iconic of the character. You'll notice, though, that as the character evolves, particularly into the Tomb Raider game, the reboot game in 2012, there is a significant change in terms of how she looks, and there's an attempt there to move beyond the more sort of skimpy outfits and into something a little bit more practical. But even so, there are still elements that remain the same. So it's fair to say that although she has changed over time because of technology and because of changing tastes, there are still certain core elements which are iconic and remain the same. Now, we're obviously not talking about the main Tomb Raider series, we're talking about Lara Croft Go, and we need to think a little bit about how the character is used in Lara Croft Go. So basically, in Lara Croft Go, Lara Croft is a puzzle piece. So in that respect, she's a lot less controllable than she is in the main series games. She's basically a marker or counter. And it doesn't, in reality, it doesn't necessarily need to be Lara Croft at all. I mean, the counter, the puzzle piece, has just been branded as Lara Croft because of her strong branding. And in the game, as in the main games, their actions are dictated by the player. So you could argue that in fact Lara Croft is a pawn, and her only relevance is her strong brand, and that she's been used to draw in fans of the original Tomb Raider games. And there are other games. It could also be argued that, in fact, the gender aspect of Lara Croft isn't relevant to the gameplay at all, and that the puzzle solutions are basically nothing to do with gender. They're simply about killing opponents or monsters or working out how to move to avoid traps. And it doesn't matter that Lara Croft in Lara Croft Go is a female character. I mean, partly if you're playing the game on tablet or on a phone screen, the character is so small it doesn't matter what she looks like, because basically she's just a figure, a tiny figure that's so small as to be impossible to see. And on the other hand, one reward that you can win by solving puzzles is you can change your outfit. And you can see there are a few examples of that. And these are all outfits that are iconic from the Tomb Raider series. So they all feature in various Tomb Raider games, including one from the original Tomb Raider, where there was a particular feature where Lara gets turned into gold. And you can see that's been represented there. So you've got these little Easter eggs that are there for fans of the game, but they don't really affect the gameplay at all. So the game is not about Lara Croft, it's a puzzle solving game. And basically, it doesn't need to be Lara Croft at all, it could be anything. So you could argue that actually the gender representation thing is not important at all. No, it depends how strongly you feel about Lara Croft as a character, whether you think that the more female representation there is in video games, the better, or whether you think that Lara Croft is a sexist male construct, and that the more we see of Lara Croft, the more it's reinforcing a female stereotype. Um, the option to change the outfits is an interesting one, because obviously it doesn't affect gameplay, but it is a trait of a lot of games where you can effectively reskin the character and make them look a bit more customizable. And that partly adds to the enjoyment of the game, and that it gives you a bit more control. As I've mentioned to you, there is that slightly fannish quality of, oh, that's the costume she wore in Tomb Raider 3 or whatever. And it's partly just to give the game a little bit of an extra goal. And quite often games do have these secondary goals. So in Lara Croft Go, for example, the primary goal is to reach the end of the board. The secondary goal is to find all the secrets. And if you find the secrets, it unlocks various other elements of the gameplay. So that adds to the replayability of the game, to make you want to find all those secrets. So I think that's why the option to change outfits is included. So we need to think about representations of good and evil, and this links to props characters. Um, we are positioned to see Lara as good. She is the hero, and therefore we are the hero, and what we're doing is good. And that, according to binary opposites, places the creature she kills as evil. And that's the preferred reading of most video games. That is, if we're looking at Stuart Hall, if we're applying that idea of reception theory, then when you're playing a video game, what your character does is right. What your character's enemies do is wrong. Now, I know it sounds a bit weird to try and apply a moral code to video games, but it is worth doing. It's worth thinking about the broader implications of the game. And I know this might spoil your enjoyment of a bit on a slightly different tack. I've been playing a game called Rust that some of you might have heard of, and this is a kind of open world role playing game where players basically can kill each other with impunity. And I did rather enjoy challenging some of the other players in the game as to why they've killed my character and what the moral implications of that were. I think they got a bit irritated with that me after a while. So you could argue that in Lara Croft Go, there are actually representational problems with what Lara does, because the creatures in the game, they don't have a moral code. They don't know that what they're doing is good or evil. They're not trying to kill Lara. Lara gets killed because she goes into their path. So the creatures aren't in themselves inherently evil, and in fact they have no free will. They're programmed. They can't avoid Lara. They can't get out of her way. So they are basically, they have no free will of their own, and therefore they can't be evil because they're not making a conscious choice. If we want to go further, Lara is a Tomb Raider. She is going into someone else's home in someone else's location, and she is looting the area. She is a thief. She is stealing stuff. So you could argue that you are being asked to play a character that is killing wildlife that cannot defend itself, and you are stealing the stuff that has been left there. The game is programmed in a way, as most role-playing games are. You don't have any alternatives to killing the creatures. There is no solution which allows you to simply avoid the creatures. You have to kill them. So, I appreciate that that is a convention of games, and that we there are obviously issues with programming and limitations of gameplay and game mechanics that mean that you couldn't build in those options. But looking at it in a moral way, it does make for a very difficult morality, because the morality is such that there is no option but to kill. And the game suggests that that is okay. The game only allows for one solution. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to have a look at that reception theory sheet, and I'd like you to fill in the points about good and evil. When you've done that, have a think about time and place. Now, the game does not specify a time, or it doesn't specify a place. And I'm not quite sure why it doesn't do that, apart from that it doesn't need to. Generally, games take place now. Generally, games take place in interesting fantasy versions of real life locations, if they're RPG games set on Earth. So in terms of Lara Croft Go, to the extent that we can know, the game seems to be set now, but like the main Tomb Raider games, there is a sense of nostalgia, and a lot of the iconography of Tomb Raider seems to come from the Indiana Jones films. Because basically Indiana Jones is a tomb raiding archaeologist, which is what Lara Croft is. The only difference really is that Lara Croft is female and Indiana Jones is male. The characters are actually very similar when you think about it. They're both strong-willed, feisty, snarky, confident characters. The Indiana Jones films are obviously set in the 30s and the 50s, and although the Tomb Raider films and games are more modern, when Lara Croft is raiding tombs, she tends to be surrounded by the ancient world or ancient iconography, and that is a feature of the Indiana Jones films. And Lara Croft Go also, in terms of the set design, if you like, does relate to the previous Tomb Raider games. So obviously Lara Croft is wearing the outfit she wore in the first game in '96. The music is the music from the original game, and so on and so forth. The sound that you get when you find a secret is the sound that you got when you found a secret in the original game, that sort of chime sound. So, although it isn't specified, the game does hark back to those original Tomb Raider games, which does give it a slightly older quality. In terms of place, the setting appears to be South America, and that's important. It's the first part of the first Tomb Raider game. I think the first levels of the first Tomb Raider game took place in Peru, in South America. So there is that direct link that's been made to the original series. And the Tomb Raider games did sometimes use what you might call lost world settings, the idea of a world outside a normal human experience, and giant animals like the giant spiders and the giant lizards in the Tomb Raider Go, Lara Croft Go, they are conventional of this kind of lost world scenario. And in terms of the place design, there are these references to ancient civilizations, that whoever it was built the original tombs that Lara is raiding. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to make sure that you've completed that reception table in as much detail as you can. When you've done that, if you can photograph your work, that should be your knowledge retrieval essay, it should be your notes on representation and your reception theory table. Please make sure you photograph that. Please make sure that you upload everything, make sure it's attached, turn it in, and then that is it.